So now I want to shift and go over the two kingdoms of bacteria life. In this diagram, we see that there are 6 kingdoms overall. All life on Earth can be divided into 6 kingdoms. You recognize plants, animals, and fungus at the top. Another day we'll learn about protista. Protista are not bacteria. Another day we'll learn about them. But look at the 2 bubbles at the bottom. There's 2 kingdoms of life called Eubacteria and Archaebacteria. Let's talk about those next.
Okay, so the first kingdom of life for bacteria that I want to discuss are called kingdom Archaebacteria. You also might see them called Archaea. Archaea, Archaebacteria, same thing. And so what I want you all to know is that these are the bacteria that live in the extreme environments of Earth. And we're going to go over 3 basic categories of Archaea, of Archaebacteria. So the picture right here implies there's the periodic symbol for oxygen with the line going through it. So this picture implies that some bacteria can live without oxygen. That's fairly extreme. There's not a lot of organisms on Earth that can live without oxygen. This picture right here implies really hot temperatures. There's some bacteria that can survive in real extreme heat. And this picture right here, I hope the picture speaks for itself, implies that some bacteria can thrive in extreme salty locations. So let's go over the kingdom Archaebacteria, kingdom Archaea. So 3 main categories, and again these 3 pictures kind of symbolize what's extreme about the 3 groups of Archaea, of Archaebacteria, that I want to go over. The first one I want to mention are called Methanogens. Now in the word methanogen, I hope you can see the word methane. So these bacteria have something to do with methane. Well, what makes them extreme, again, is that they're cells that are called anaerobic. These bacteria are anaerobic in that they can survive without oxygen. Well, the reason they're called methanogens is because, like their name implies, they produce methane. So methanogenic bacteria are actually fairly common in the intestines, the intestinal tract, the digestive tract of, for instance, humans. And like the name methane implies, and you can see the picture right there, the person farting, well, I think we finally answered an age-old question of where do farts come from? Well, farts come from the methane that is produced in our intestines. So the bacteria that is living inside of our intestines will produce methane as a waste product. That methane builds up in our intestines, and every now and then we let go of it in a funny sounding fart. So methanogens, that's one of the categories of Archaea, of Archaebacteria, that I want you all to know about. The second category of Archaea, of Archaebacteria, are called Halophiles. And Halophiles, what's so extreme about them is that they thrive in very, very salty environments. Now, you might be thinking, well, what's the big deal? There's a lot of life in the salty oceans. Well, the saltiness of the oceans is nowhere near extreme enough to find these Archaebacteria called Halophiles. You think of the saltier locations of Earth other than the oceans, the Dead Sea and the Great Salt Lake in Utah. These are where we find Archaea, Archaebacteria called Halophiles. They live in extreme salty environments. And if you ask yourself, do you remember from earlier in the school year what normally happens to cells when they're placed in salt water? Well, watch this animation. When cells are normally placed in salt water, through the process of diffusion, they lose water, dehydrate, and shrivel up and die. But what's interesting about halophiles is they thrive in these salty environments, way too salty for fish and other aquatic organisms. So here's a picture along the coast of the Dead Sea, and you can see the white salt that's been washed up onto the rocks in this picture here. So again, the Dead Sea, like the name implies, is a dead body of water. There's really no life in the Dead Sea, with the exception of halophiles, halophilic bacteria. And then there's the third category of Archaea, of Archaebacteria, I want you to know about, called Thermophiles. Now, like the prefix thermo, that should imply heat. These bacteria can live in extreme heats, extremely hot environments. The picture shows an underwater, what's called vent, an underwater ocean vent near the bottom or on the bottom of the ocean floor. There's these little cracks in the crust, and it's called a vent because there's all this gas spewing and escaping from the mantle of the Earth. And so all these gases and minerals are spewing out of these what are called vents. And we were shocked to find, only in the 1980s I believe, we were shocked to find that there are thriving ecosystems down here. And the reason for that is because of thermophilic bacteria that can survive in these extremely hot environments where they're feeding on the minerals and then other things eat the bacteria. And then you have a food chain. So we were actually pretty shocked to discover these in the 1980s. We also see in the hot springs of Yellowstone National Park, we see thermophilic bacteria. But these are three extreme groups of life here: Methanogens, Halophiles, and Thermophiles.
So pause the video if you want a little flow diagram. Those of you that like visual summaries, visual diagrams, you might want to pause it and just jot this down. But I'm going to move on. So the other kingdom of life for bacteria are called the Eubacteria. These are the modern bacteria. These are the bacteria that are common to most environments on Earth. These are the bacteria that you think of when you hear the word bacteria. And so what I want you to first mention is that if a person has a bacteria infection, they have a Eubacteria infection. And the first step in treating their infection is to identify, is this person infected with a gram-negative infection, or does the person have a gram-positive infection? Well, first of all, from the picture to the left, we see the words might be a little small. The picture on the left shows a gram-positive bacteria. Look at the picture on the right. That's a gram-negative bacteria. You can see the picture on the right. Bacteria cells have 3 layers. You can see a layer in green, a thin layer in brown, and a layer on the bottom in orange. Gram-negative bacteria are harder to treat because these bacteria have these 3 outer layers, that green outer layer called the capsule. Harder to treat, which means the person would have to take a stronger, more intense, maybe more than one antibiotic in order to cure their infection. But the gram-positive bacteria, you can see that there's only 2 layers. There's a thick layer in brown, and then there's a layer in orange at the bottom. These are called gram-positive. And when you stain them, I'll show you what the gram stain is in just a moment. There's a test that you can do if a person has an infection. The test is called a gram stain. And underneath the microscope, when the test is finished, the cells will look either pink or the cells will look purple. That tells you whether or not the person has a gram-negative or a gram-positive infection. If a person has a gram-positive infection, underneath the microscope, the bacteria will look purple. These bacteria are easier to treat, so you don't have to use the harsh, extreme antibiotics. And also, they would only maybe have to take only 1 antibiotic instead of 2 or 3 different kinds of antibiotics. So here's 2 pictures. There's a pink picture on top showing gram-negative. There's a purple picture on the bottom showing gram-positive. So one of the first steps in treating a person with a bacteria infection is to identify what kind of bacteria does the person have. Do you have a gram-negative infection? Do you have a gram-positive infection? Because the treatment that the person goes through might be different depending on whether or not it's negative or positive. So these are some of the common features of Eubacteria. You cannot do a gram stain with the Archaea. Archaea have different kinds of cell walls. Eubacteria have a cell wall that has a few sugars and amino acids in it called peptidoglycan. Peptidoglycan is something that you can only find in Eubacteria cell walls. That's what the gram stain looks for. So based on how thick the cell wall is, whether or not it stains pink or purple, we can figure out if they're negative or positive. Here's a quick overview, a quick summary of what a gram stain is. So after you grow a person's bacteria, you would stain the person's bacteria with the objects in the picture. Stain the person's bacteria with a dye called crystal violet, and then another dye called iodine. And then you wash it with alcohol, and then you stain the bacteria with another dye called safranin. And then you could look at the bacteria underneath the microscope, and you would see that they would either be pink or purple. That would be the results of your gram stain. There's a category of bacteria I want you to know about that are called cyanobacteria. And if you look in the pictures, all these cyanobacteria in the pictures are green. That should imply that they do photosynthesis. They have chlorophyll. They can do photosynthesis. So cyanobacteria are autotrophic. They do photosynthesis, and they completely changed the world. Watch this. Cyanobacteria are really important in terms of evolution. Here's a little animation showing the sun giving off UV radiation. At this time in Earth's history, we're talking 3.5 billion years ago, there was no life on land because the Earth had no ozone layer. The only way for life to survive on land is underneath the water, because water acts as a shield. UV cannot penetrate very deep into the water. So water provided a home for the first life on Earth. And bacteria were the first anything on Earth to produce oxygen by doing photosynthesis. Cyanobacteria, because they do photosynthesis, released oxygen. The oxygen is a gas, and like all gases, the gases drifts and diffuses and spreads out and accumulates. But this has been going on for millions and millions and millions and millions and millions of years. Over time, watch this. Over time, the oxygen from cyanobacteria created a shield, created our ozone layer. And now that you have the formation of an ozone layer, look at how the animation has changed. The UV radiation no longer is striking the ground. This was a major requirement for evolution of life on Earth, because now that you have an ozone layer blocking UV radiation, over, of course, millions and millions and millions of years, hundreds of millions of years, life slowly began to evolve on dry land. Eventually, plants and amphibians and all the life that you see today have colonized land. This could not happen without the formation of the ozone layer. So cyanobacteria really changed the Earth and the history of life on Earth forever. Really important cyanobacteria in that sense right there. So again, pause the video if you like flow diagrams, and it's just a little visual, some of the key features of some of the categories of bacteria. So the last slide I want to talk about is how are bacteria helpful? Well, bacteria are incredibly helpful in nature. We just mentioned cyanobacteria changed the world. They created oxygen to make the ozone layer. And here's a little political cartoon. It says there's two cyanobacteria cells talking to one another about 2.5 billion years ago. And I know it's a little blurry, so the one on the left says, if we keep emitting oxygen, we could cause a catastrophic change in the atmosphere. And the cyanobacteria on the right says, nonsense. The Earth is too big and we are too insignificant to have any effect on it. Drop your cheap alarmism already. Well, this is kind of a political cartoon relating to climate change and global warming. There are a small group of people who argue that humans are too small of an animal to cause climate change, that climate change is caused by some other factor. There's a small group of people who think that humans are too small to have any effect on the Earth. And this is kind of a good point the cartoon is making. Well, bacteria are even smaller than humans. They change the Earth. If bacteria can change the atmosphere, why can't humans? Granted, bacteria did it over millions and millions of years, But in the past few centuries, humans have been releasing a lot of pollution into our atmosphere, changing climate around the world. Getting back to bacteria. Bacteria are really good decomposers. They don't just recycle carbon. I'm only labeling carbon because carbon is the foundation of organic molecules. Decomposers are incredibly important in recycling organic molecules. Carbon-based molecules, proteins, carbohydrates, lipids, nucleic acids, they're incredibly important to that. Bacteria are important if you think back to the ecology chapter on the nitrogen cycle. Here's a picture, those little brown growths, you can see these are roots of plants, and there's about 15 or 20 little brown growths that you can see in the picture. These are little clusters of bacteria, nitrogen-fixing bacteria. The bacteria will convert nitrogen into a usable form that the plant can absorb through the roots, and then nitrogen moves up the food chain. Another way that bacteria are really helpful is just food, in the production of food. Bacteria do a process called fermentation, and we use fermentation to create various kinds of food. And here's a small list of foods created from bacteria fermentation. You might recognize some of these as maybe a favorite snack of yours. I'm going through a phase right now where I really like Greek yogurt. Bacteria have been used to make antibiotics. Now, most antibiotics that we have come from fungus, but some do actually come from other bacteria. Some bacteria make antibiotics to kill other bacteria. If you're a bacteria and can kill your competition, you're more likely to survive and reproduce. And we've learned that some bacteria actually make antibiotics, which we can then give to people who have infections. And we're also using bacteria in industry. The picture on the bottom shows a couple individuals cleaning up after an oil spill. They're spraying, you can see a mist being sprayed on these rocks after an oil spill. There's a species of bacteria that will literally feed on the petroleum of the oil spill and break down the oil into less harmful materials. So we're using bacteria to help clean up oil spills and environmental disasters. We're also using bacteria to produce fuel, biofuels. If you've ever heard of a gasoline called E85, it stands for 85% ethanol. Ethanol is an alcohol that we can use to run automobiles, and it comes from bacteria fermenting corn. And when we use bacteria to ferment corn, we make this alcohol called ethanol, which we can use to fuel automobiles. It's a lot cleaner than burning gasoline. So there's all kinds of useful benefits of bacteria. They're not all negative, even though the word bacteria might scare us because we think of germs and disease. A lot of bacteria are very helpful. Even though a lot of bacteria are very helpful, here's some very gross pictures of disease that bacteria can cause. First of all, here's a healthy picture of teeth and healthy picture of gums. Well, the next picture, this picture shows a dental problem called gingivitis. You can see the gums are a little red and puffy. Well, that's because the gums are infected. They're a little red and puffy. They're swollen gums, and they're infected with bacteria. Now, if you go to the dentist, your dentist will see this, and you'll start the cleaning process in order to correct this. But ultimately, the problem could get even worse and could lead to something called periodontitis. Look at this. The gums are really red, really puffy. You can see the plaque in between the teeth, and it almost looks like the teeth are growing, but that's not the case. It's the gums that are shrinking, and when the gums recede, or when the gums shrink, it exposes more tooth. And eventually, if this is not treated, it can lead to what's called advanced periodontitis. Look at how gross this is. You can see this person really has infected gums, and so this person really is going to need some intense dental care. But I hope you see the moral of the story is to brush your teeth, floss your teeth, and rinse your teeth on a very regular basis. One of the concerns with bacteria, of course, is bacteria resistance. In these cute cartoons, you've seen them before. In the upper left-hand corner, when you take an antibiotic, most bacteria die. In the upper right-hand corner, however, some bacteria survive. Notice how the bacteria is wearing a helmet. That's symbolic of a bacteria that is resistant to an antibiotic. In the lower left-hand corner, the strong bacteria reproduce. That reproduction process is called binary fission. And in the lower right-hand corner, when the disease has now returned, you take an antibiotic again, but look, only bacteria with helmets are left. The bacteria has become resistant, so the antibiotic just doesn't work anymore. This is a very serious concern. So make sure if you have to take an antibiotic, you're using it properly.
Okay, so now that we've reached the end, go ahead and pause the video and try to answer these questions on a piece of paper. And if you want me to check your answers before class one day, come on in before school, come on in after school. I'll be happy to check your answers for accuracy. So go ahead and pause the video and do your best on these. Good luck.